Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. My name's David Mudd from BSI, and just before we start, as we've got a pretty full house here anyway, I just want to ask a couple of questions of you guys first to help me frame what I'm going to talk about and make sure it's as impactful as possible. So, how many here have, if any of you, saw a presentation we did on this a year ago? Anyone see us do here a year ago? Anyone see us at Cybersec in Brussels a few months ago? Okay, so it's a fresh audience. Okay, questions are still coming. A couple more questions. NIS2, we've all been talking about it for a couple of years. How many people here are broadly familiar with NIS2? That's going to save me. Okay, there's a few new to it. Broadly speaking, we know NIS2. Good. And what about 27001? How many people here know 27001? Great. Okay. That means I can skip through some of the summary and focus on the real content today. And do feel free to have some questions. What I will say is, if you've got any questions as we go along, I might even say that raise your hand then, rather than wait to the end. And we're happy to take questions as we go. So, we've got a couple of minutes, but hey, it's a full house, so a lot to talk about, so let's go. So as I said, my name is David Mudd. I'm the Global Head of Digital Trust Assurance at BSI, the British Standards Institution. I'm joined today by my colleague Christian, who's one of our experts out there speaking with people like you day in, day out on information security, cybersecurity, NIS2, and of course 27001. So a little bit about BSI, first of all. Who are we? We have British in the name, but most of our 84,000 clients, and indeed our own team, are outside of the UK, with a very strong presence here in the Netherlands. And what do we actually do? So we write standards. 27001 started off as a British standard. That's been one that's been very close to my heart for many years. We write standards. We also then help embed those standards with training, certification, support around regulation, and consulting as well. And we do that in what are the key areas of quality, health, safety and well-being, sustainability, and of course, digital trust, which is the bit for me that's the important, exciting and fun bit. So before we go into NIS2, I know everybody says this, but I have to reinforce and make the point. The news isn't about regulation and a directive, it's about the reason why this is even needed in the first place. And with all of the challenges and delays around NIS2, we must keep this in focus. Cyber crime is now the third biggest global economy behind the US and China. That's what we're dealing with here. And ransomware continues to evolve and continues to mature. And week in, week out, we see the latest big ransomware hits. Supply chain. The story used to be your bad guys will be coming after your information. They will go for your weakest link. That might be your supply chain. That's fundamentally changed. With the extensive digital supply chains we have now, your supply chain is the primary target vector. If you hit the right entity in your supply chain, you don't hit one organization or 10, you hit 100 or 1,000 in one hit. So your supply chain now is potentially your biggest area of risk. And vulnerabilities continue to increase. And you'll see some examples of that as we move on. So, NIS2, we're all familiar with it, published last year, came into force. However, transpositions across the EU are all over the place. Here in the Netherlands, we're now talking about middle of next year. So, fantastic. What's the problem? You think, middle of next year, I've got 99 problems to deal with today, and NIS2 isn't one. Fantastic. But you obviously don't think that. You're all here. You see there's a problem. But what we are seeing is some organizations and leadership are thinking, if the pedal's coming off the gas, why should I be bothered about this right now? And so to help you with those discussions with the leaders and the others in your business, when you who are caring about that, that's why you're here today, need to consider these two things. Firstly, NIS2 came into force last year. The obligations under NIS2 stand and apply right now to every entity in scope. until the transpositions come in, that top-level directive is there in force. And secondly, is my very first point. It's not about the directive, it's about the reason why it's here in the first place. I actually, ironically, translated this into English, but I should have just left it in Dutch for you guys, so it's a bit crazy for me to do that. But you look at this extremely well-publicized hack, which was a breach of some of the most sensitive data you could possibly imagine at an immense scale just last month. And likewise, the Dutch National Cybersecurity Center giving out a warning that this critical exploitation of one of the vulnerabilities I was talking about here being focused directly on the critical sectors. The Office of the Prosecutor was one and others being hit. So, firstly, yes, NIS2 might not be transposed until next year, but your obligations still apply right now today. And secondly, that threat is real and there is impacting critical organizations in the Netherlands right now today. So that's the reason for organizations to really pay attention right now, never mind the transposition date. So what is NIS2? You're all familiar with it. The key points really to focus on here are those stricter requirements around risk management and particularly incident reporting, and that big focus on the supply chain. As I said, that's been the big evolution in the threat landscape, and that's now why it's reflected in NIS2, and it's the same in the UK with the new Cyber Resilience Act, focuses on supply chain legislation around the world. So even if you are familiar with 27001 and you feel you've got everything in place, the area where NIS2 really focuses on, and we see clients struggling with to a certain extent or need to focus on, is the supply chain, and we'll touch on more of that later. So who's impacted? Again, you're all familiar, so you know there's the 15 sectors and there's essential entities and important entities. But behind that, what we are seeing, going back to my comment on the supply chain, is that even if you're not primarily in scope, if you are providing business services to an organization who is an essential entity, then the pressure, because of that focus on the supply chain, is coming down on wider organizations, not directly in scope, who are providing services to show that they can comply as well. Hence, the pressure on the supply chain means the impact of NIS2 goes way beyond those 15 critical sectors. And I would say most of the clients we are engaged with on NIS2 right now are actually providers into that sector more than those who are directly impacted. So NIS2 has 46 articles, and it has a whole load of other blurb before you even get to that. There are pages of it. You will bore yourself to death reading every single word in NIS2, okay? But there are 3 articles for entities in scope that it is worth focusing on and reading. So Article 20 covers governance, 21, the real focus, which is the actual risk management measures, and then 23, the reporting obligations. So I'm not saying everybody go and read the whole of NIS2, really, really not. But if you're potentially an entity in scope, it's those 3 articles that are really important. And what do they cover? Firstly, governance. And this really puts the onus on the leadership of the organization, makes them directly liable for any infringements. Also, a mandatory requirement to follow training, and not training on how not to click on phishing emails. This is training of your management to make sure they can do that governance of cybersecurity effectively. So this is not just an IT issue, and this is one of the key points to take to your leadership to make sure that they engage. And certainly some of the conversations, Christian, we had yesterday were from CTOs and CISOs really, hey, I'm liable for this. What do I need to do? So that liability is the big wake-up call to get your management involved. When we're looking at the core requirements here, the key points are, firstly, that it's risk-based, and those of you familiar with 27001, it's that same risk-based approach. So levels of security appropriate to the risk posed that are also proportionate. And that's great because that gives flexibility. What is right for a very large global organization working across all EU areas in a sensitive area like healthcare, dealing with very sensitive data, is going to be very different from a small organization located in just one site in the Netherlands, who may be an important entity working in waste management. So to have that flexibility is really useful. However, that brings its own challenge, which is around certainty, legal certainty of compliance. If that flexibility is there, how do you know that what you've done is enough? Taking a little bit more detail here, there are 10 minimum requirements within Article 21. Those of you familiar with 27001, you'll see, broadly speaking, there's nothing to be scared of here. These are all things that are covered generally within 27001. And there's only 10 points. Surely this can't be too much to deal with. But behind this is quite a bit of detail. A few of these I just want to lift out. Supply chain, as I said, this is the big one. There are controls within 27001 Annex A, 93 controls, 5 of which focus on supply chain, 1 of which including cloud suppliers. So surely that covers it. But you look, specific security-related aspects of relationships with all direct suppliers. That's a lot of work in there. Do you even know who all your direct suppliers are? Security through the whole of the life cycle of your network and information systems. And then what they've put together under I is in fact 3 separate complex areas in their own right: human resources, access protection, and asset management. So there are 10 requirements here, but actually there's quite a lot of involved to comply with them. So what does compliance actually look like? As I mentioned, the transpositions are still a long way off. Each country implements international law with its own methods of demonstrating compliance. But as we'll come on to, 27001 provides a very trustworthy and robust framework to demonstrate compliance across all jurisdictions. So Belgium, as you may be aware, is one of the ones that has completed a transition and has got clear guidance on compliance. And they've said that all essential entities in scope have to have a regular compliance assessment, and 27001 certification by an approved certification body is a route forward. Fantastic. But they've put a little caveat here which says, subject to acceptability of the scope and statement of applicability. Now, I've had a few conversations with the director of the Belgian Centre for Cybersecurity on this, and it's something happy can share with anybody later if you want to come over to our booth. But we'll touch a bit on this very important point. Having 27001 does not guarantee that you're compliant with NIS2. There are certain aspects that you really need to focus on, and that's what we're going to be talking about a bit later on. One other point to mention, there's quite a few, I think, in the audience here who might fall under one of these categories. Cloud service provider, managed service provider, and managed security provider. As you can see, some others as well. If you're in this group, the EU has recognized that your work will quite probably cross boundaries and go from maybe one jurisdiction to another. Because of that, they have developed a very specific implementation regulation that gives detail on exactly how to comply with those points in the regulation. And it is aligned very closely with 27001. Many of the words are lifted directly from it. And there's a QR code to take you directly to the official journal and then be able to download that document. So if you're in one of these categories, then this is an absolute goldmine of information to help you actually comply in a language that makes sense if you're familiar with 27001. So this gives a summary of what's in there. There are 27 pages of clear, detailed implementation requirements that are based on what you will be very familiar with 27001. Also gives you a definition of a significant incident. So as we come on to reporting, one of the questions we often get is, what do I have to report? What's significant and what isn't? Again, this is clearly laid out. So one of the things to consider if you've got a 27001 information security management system, you can just bring this set of requirements directly into your statement of applicability. It becomes a very straightforward way of being able to evidence compliance within a certified ISMS. I put the QR code on there in case you missed it from the first one. So I can't say strongly enough, this is a real goldmine of information. Now, I could talk for absolutely hours, days, weeks on this subject, but I'm now going to hand over to someone who's a lot closer to working with this day in, day out, to Christian. So Christian, over to you.
Thank you, David. Are you coming this way? Yeah. Yesterday you went that way. Yeah. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Christian, and I'm a client manager for BSI, which means that I perform audits for the ISO 27001 on a daily basis with smaller and bigger organizations. And I tend to, what you say, read it until you're bored till you're deaf. I read the ISO 27001 based on that context, actually. So really nice to be here, and I thank you for the great introduction into the NIS2, and you already hinted somewhere to the ISO 27001 a few times, of course. It's up to me to talk to you about the comparison between the ISO 27001 and the NIS2 again, and this time in more detail from the perspective of the ISO 27001. So first, let's have a small look at what the ISO 27001 actually is. It is a management framework that helps you to continually improve your processes around information security. And it helps also to enhance a culture of digital trust within your organization, because everybody in the organization needs to be involved based on their own role and their own authorization there. It specifically addresses, for example, that supply chain that my colleague talked about, and ICT continuity. And that governance is also really firmly in there. Clause 5 especially about management and their responsibilities even. And apart from the clauses 4 to 10, there are also more than 90 security controls that can be flexibly implemented based on the context of the organization. Well, in the core, as any management system, just as the 9001 and the 14001, the 27001 is also based on Plan, Do, Check, Act, that we all know probably. And you see here a graphic that shows that you a bit what that's all about. And it enhances continual improvement at the end of that circle here, of course. And in the planning part, there's also a risk assessment embedded. And I'm really happy that my colleague made this nice slide, because it shows you so well where the plan, do, and the check and the act in the clauses of the standard are. Yeah, make a picture of that. That's a really good one, because I always have a lot of discussion with my customers, because they seem to mix those up, and they seem to scatter them around a bit. But as you can see, the plan is actually the biggest one. So you need to be proactive and plan what you want to do, which also includes that risk assessment in the third part. The operation is the do part, which most of the organizations focus on the best. And then you have the performance evaluation, which is internal audit and management review. It leads back to the 5 again, management review. And then the improvement, which triggers you to continually improve your processes and to make it better over time. And that's what the management system is. So we are really happy. It's a bit pity that that's Belgium here, but we are really happy that we are the first and NIS2 authorized body within Belgium, listed as accredited certification body for the ISO 27001. And that leads back to what David just mentioned, that within the Belgium rules, it is one of the ways to comply with the NIS2 is sort of to also have certification for the 27001. And we really hope to do the same thing in the Netherlands, of course, but as we don't have a government at the moment, we're waiting for that. So we are going to have a look at the 4 articles, or 3 articles you mentioned, and we're going to link them back to the ISO 27001 annex controls to see what's happening there. And we get a lot of questions, can you provide us with this slide? You can make pictures of it, but as your code was scanned at the start of this, at the entrance, you will get this in the email afterwards, okay? You can still make pictures, of course. But what you see here is governance, which my colleague talked about, Article 21, cybersecurity risks, and on the next slide, we have also the reporting obligations. And what happens here is that we managed to find a lot of controls that are aligned with those articles of the NIS2. And that actually makes a lot of sense. For example, there was this supply chain. Where is it? I'm looking for it. I can't find it. Oh, there it is. The supply chain. You can see that NXA 5.19 up to 5.23 are exactly the ones in the NIS in the ISO 27001 that are aligned with supply chain and suppliers in general. And 5.20 is specifically for supply chains. Sorry, 5.21. I'm reading it sideways. And also the other one you mentioned here is reporting obligations, which points to a few annexes around incident management of the ISO 27001 standard. So far it really looks good, but the compliance with the NIS2 requires more than only simply mapping and implementing those. Because even though the 27001 gives you guidance, it does not take really into account the specific requirements of the NIS2. We're going to show you some examples of that. Well, first of all, let's see that supply chain. I pointed it out before. This is what is aligned with the ISO 27001, but when you look at the requirement of the NIS2, it specifically says, take into account the vulnerabilities specific to each direct supplier. So that means you need to take into account the context and what services they deliver and what information security aspects would apply to that. What requirements do you put on this supplier? And that could be different from a data center than from software developer, for example. So I must say, in my daily job, I already do this. I already ask customers to specifically say what requirements are on each supplier, but it is not directly in that way in the ISO 27001, but it is in the NIS2. So you still need to take that into account when you want to implement the ISO 27001 in such a way that it helps you to comply with the NIS2. There's also a really nice one in the context of reporting obligations. I already mentioned that the ISO 27001 requires you to implement some type of incident management process, which is great. But it does not say anything about how fast you need to raise an incident or anything like that. The NIS2 does state that, just like the GDPR actually, it talks about 24 hours, and this one we recognize from the GDPR, further detail required within 72 hours. So only having the incident management system is not enough. You also need to check the requirements of the NIS2 to make that incident management system in such a way that it complies with the NIS2. Well, and my colleague already mentioned really firmly that having the processes in scope that the NIS2 applies to is really important when you want to use the ISO 27001 for your compliance with the NIS2. You also need to determine correct boundaries, and I see a lot of organizations don't do the third point, make a formal document what your scope involves. So please don't forget about that, otherwise we will be whining. Risk management. My colleague talked about a risk hazard approach that is completely embedded in what the ISO 27001 is. There's a complete clause for that. And it's even more important within the 27001 than, for example, the 9 or the 14. And then that statement of applicability, you can use, you must indicate in the statement of applicability what the reason for inclusion is. And you can also make a column for that for the NIS2. This one is embedded, implemented because of a NIS2 requirement. For example, that incident management that we just talked about. And this slide was the same as the other one, remember? Yeah, okay, we skipped this one. So when we summarize this a bit, we could say that the NIS2 tells you what needs to be done, and the ISO 27001 tells you how to do it. With that one remark, that you always need to look back to the specific requirements, like timing, like specific things for suppliers and everything. So to summarize this all, it is the ISO 27001 tells you how to do it. It includes, from its core, a risk-based approach. It is a structured framework that already has proven its value over decades now for many, many organizations. And it also motivates a positive culture around information security in general to include the whole organization. And which is really important, this is not only an IT party. Actually, the most responsible persons in the organization is management. And that also leads back to the NIS2 again. And apart from only compliance with the NIS2, it also motivates continual improvement, which in the end gives you a lot of profit. And this one is yours, isn't it? Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Christian. And actually, I'll just go back to this point here. So Christian explained the steps in the process. But as I mentioned, if you are a managed service provider, for instance, you've got 93 controls in there, but you can take the commission regulation implementation, which is very, very similar wording, and just take that directly into your statement of applicability. Make it very, very clear what you have to action yourselves as an organization and how you demonstrate compliance. So it's not just about those 93 controls. You can take something else that might be applicable and stick it within the statement of applicability as well. So that's the benefit of that flexibility of 27001. So the first point is, unless you understand NIS2, and by NIS2, I don't mean all however many hundreds of pages that will bore yourself to death reading. I mean the relevant part. So those particular articles, understand that. Articles 20, 21, and 23. Understand the national transposition status. In Netherlands, there isn't one, okay? So you have to go back, in that case, to the top level NIS2 requirement. And for 27001, the mapping tools can certainly help you, but you have to understand what it is you need to do when you're implementing the how you need to do it. So then ensuring the NIS2 detail is covered within the implementation. So it's not just a case of, yes, I've got those controls, tick, have I actually covered what is stated in Articles 20, 21, and 23? So what can BSI do to help? Well, certainly for our 27001 clients, it's now a relatively straightforward process to have an additional audit that then looks at specifically, have they addressed the NIS2 requirements? So to do that, we check the scope. Have you got your legal obligations in scope that are relevant to where you're operating, the national transposition? Have you then taken into your statement of applicability the right controls, and have you specifically implemented it? So it basically comprises a check of your scope and statement of applicability, an audit of the implementation, and then delivery of a letter of recognition. So a letter of recognition then acknowledges that you have addressed the requirements in NIS2 through an ISMS certified to ISO 27001. Now, it's not a letter of certifying you comply with the directive, because we're not in a position to do that. But what it does say is you have addressed the requirements of that directive within a certified ISMS, as I said. Last point I want to make really is why to work with BSI. One thing I didn't mention in the intro is that we are an independent organization, independent of government, but also independent of shareholders. We are governed by what's known in the UK as a royal charter, similar to organizations like the BBC, which means it gives us independence, but it also means we don't pay shareholders. Everything we do make gets put back into the business to improve progress, to improve standards. So a big part of our mandate is to share information and actually help industry navigate these complex areas of regulation in particular, with the aim of allowing you to create better products and get better products to the market in a way that's compliant and trusted. So that's why we're here. And at this point, I will say, do we have any questions? Quite a lot we've rattled through there. Any questions from anybody? What? Oh, you do? Yes.
My question is purely about NIS2, not the ISO. So I'm working in the NIS2 project, and I'm responsible for doing the registration of the legal entities. I believe you haven't mentioned the registration, but right now I have this one obstacle that I'm dealing with, and it's the liability issue of who is going to do the registration. So I just wanted to ask, do you know anything about it? Or the liability is on the board level in NIS2?
So when it comes to the liability, you're then talking about, in general, the liability of the organization. Where does that lie? So the actual wording there, effectively, it talks about the management or the leadership. Now, in what I've seen, again, I'm not necessarily the authority on this, generally speaking, it lies with the C-suite. And that's where we're seeing, at the moment, this is where we're seeing them coming to us saying, oh my gosh, I've just realized I'm liable for this, what do I need to do? So that's where we are seeing it. Now, I couldn't make a formal legal comment on that, but generally speaking, that's where we're seeing the liability lies. And that seems to be the first call that the authorities have, is is the C-suite, effectively, where that sits. Okay, hopefully that helps clarify. Certainly we're seeing that's where suddenly we're seeing people waking up when they see that liability phrase in there. If anyone has any questions they want to discuss with us on a one-to-one, we'll be around after this, and we're over at booth E61, which is diagonally opposite from here. So thank you for your patience, thank you for your time. Any questions, do come up. In the meantime, enjoy the rest of your show and safe trip home. Thank you.